Okay, if I'm a little hyper in this video, it's because San Marino literally just announced their national final for next year's Eurovision, and holy wow, okay, maybe people do watch this series after all. But anyway, stay calm. Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, and my oh my, do I have a story for you today. I don't intend to keep flip-flopping back and forth between talking about games I love and games that I don't really feel, but given the time of year, it feels wholly and entirely appropriate that I dedicate at least some time to the amazing piece of work that is Oxenfree. If you're supporting me on Patreon, now seems like an excellent time, what with Halloween approaching, and if you're not a patron at the moment, but you're still watching this at the time it goes live, well, November is still decently gloomy enough that a ghost story would fit the mood. It's not just me, right? But I'm getting ahead of myself. What actually is Oxenfree? Well, aside from the last word in a bizarre American schoolyard catchphrase that I still, to this day, don't comprehend in the slightest, it's also a 2D side-scrolling visual novel of sorts, developed by California-based company Night School Studio. Singular. I would have thought it'd be studios plural, but no. It was initially released for PC and Xbox One, though it steadily bled out into other operating systems and consoles in the months that followed its primary thrust onto the market. The PC and Xbox One versions came out on the 15th of January 2016, while the PlayStation 4 version had to wait until the 31st of May that year, and at the time of filming this, the Switch version just came out last week, on the 6th of October 2017. Yikes. Then again, the Switch is a new console, so that's not too surprising. I mean, we just barely found out at that time that it wasn't going to be called the NX, so I'm getting off topic, aren't I? Alright, let's rein it in a little. I said Oxenfree is a side-scrolling visual novel, but that sells it a little short. In truth, there isn't a way to describe it in a pleasantly modest number of words that still covers all the bases that it needs to. The game takes on a 2D side-scrolling perspective, but the physics of the game function almost like a platformer, albeit a platformer without the ability to jump. But that's not relevant to the way the game is actually played, and I tip my hat to that for being a unique take on the genre. Rather than using its perspective as a crucial element to the gameplay, it's simply a stage on which the game's events unfold. More than anything else, it's one of those choices matter kind of visual novels, where the core gameplay is more about walking through the game's story, making almost constant choices about how Alex, the player character, responds to situations and conversations, which in turn ultimately dictates how the situation develops. But let's back up for a second. What's the actual story here? What's your motivation for playing God with this teenager's interpersonal relationships? Well, it all starts with 5 teenagers heading off to the not-so-remote Edwards Island, an old US Army outpost, to participate in their high school's tradition of having an all-night party on the beach. Tragically, this plan fizzles out when it becomes apparent that only 5 people actually bothered to turn up, and after one of them breaks away from the group to investigate weird noises coming from a cave on the beach, things take a turn for the especially bizarre. Very Scooby-Doo, I know. Now, before we get any further, I think it's quite pertinent that we get to know those 5 characters. After all, they are the driving force behind the story, and in a quite convenient way that I absolutely love, each one has their own distinct identifying colour when their nameplate appears in the subtitles at the bottom of the screen. I was so enamoured with that concept that when I Let's Played the game for myself, I inserted myself right into that system, thank you very much, so if ever I made any remarks in my commentary that broke in through the fourth wall from the outside going in, they would be subtitled along with everybody else's lines headed by a pink nameplate reading Tess. Predictably enough. But enough about me. I'll spare you the agonisingly minute details, but our protagonist, rocking a pleasant Mizu blue name tag, is one Alex. After losing her brother in a tragic drowning accident, her parents separated from one another, and the nature of her brother's death has become a major point of contention within her life and the lives of those around her. However, that leads us into Jonas, represented by a dark green name tag. He entered Alex's life as her new stepbrother, originally from a much rougher neck of the woods. He's friendly enough, but this is his first opportunity to really be integrated into the local social circles. Next up is Reginald, or Ren for short, whose colour is purple. He's an airhead and a pothead, and to be honest, he's quite a Marmite character. If you like him, you'll love his antics. If you dislike him, your patience with him will evaporate within minutes. But I mean that as a compliment to how he's written, I promise. Incidentally, Ren has something of a crush on Little Miss Orange, Nona. She's somewhat of what TV Tropes calls a cloud cuckoo lander, and she's my personal favourite of the squad, to be honest. Alas, she's also the cast member you spend the categorical least amount of time with. And finally, with her red text being the first major red flag, there's Clarissa, close friend of Nona and ex-girlfriend of Alex's deceased brother. Unsurprisingly, she holds Alex accountable for his death, and the death of her happiness along with it. She's cold, she's impatient, she's sarcastic, and rather predictably, she ends up being the closest thing to the antagonist of the group. And the story is all about one crazy night stranded on an abandoned island with nobody but each other for company, or so it seems. So what makes the game so great in my eyes, then? Well, the best place to start, I think, would be by looking at the game's foundation, the story itself. To speak in very broad strokes indeed, tee-hee, it's one of those spooky, paranormal thrillers that's so popular nowadays, peppered with mystery, intrigue, and enough emphasis on character relationships to keep the player invested, though I'll come back to that last point in greater detail in a hot minute. The point is, it's a modern ghost story that doesn't just play up to old-fashioned cliches, and through the power of great writing from the perspectives of both narrative and character, it knows how to retain its audience. Long story short, it's kind of like a playable Gravity Falls, albeit similar but different, which is a helpful description, I know. More specifically, the story starts, as I already explained, 5 teens going to a decommissioned US Army base for the night to have a party. After hearing rumours about weird radio signals coming from one of the caves on the beach, Jonas goes off by himself to investigate, and Alex chases after him to make sure her new stepbrother doesn't get into any trouble, while Ren just kind of sits there in a drug-induced haze because that's just what Ren is like. I'd put a spoiler warning here, but this is literally the opening act of the game, so... In catching up with him, she tunes her pocket radio, which she has at Ren's request, just specifically for investigating this stuff, into a strange triangular projection-looking thing, and the next thing they know, the whole group has been split up and scattered across the island, with no memory of how that had come to pass exactly. The first main arc of the story, once that's happened, involves Alex and Jonas exploring the island to try to reunite their friends after receiving leads on where Ren and Clarissa might have ended up, and pleasingly enough, the game lets you decide which one to look for first. You don't lose out on anything either way, beyond just perhaps your in-game reputation with whomever you leave until later, possibly. Canonically, I think you're expected to go after Ren first, but the choice remains firmly yours. Either way, it quickly becomes apparent that the weirdness going on the island is the work of a bunch of malicious ghosts, more specifically, the crew of the sunken US submarine, the Kanaloa, whose crew was stationed on Edwards Island prior to having its experimental nuclear engine blown up in friendly fire. Yeah, that's kind of a lot of spoilers all at once, but it's sort of crucial to understanding the story, so you're welcome? It sounds over the top, and the way the ghosts manifest themselves within just the first chapter may even be over the top in the same way, but it's all done in a manner that's self-aware without being a self-parody. In not so many words, it takes itself seriously in such a way that you're invited to, as the player, as well. At the end of the first arc, Ren and Nona are brought back to where Alex and Jonas woke up, a watchtower named after one Major Dick Harden.
The guy's name was Major Dick Harden?
See, the game does know what to do with comic relief. But yes, it seems the ghosts took Clarissa before Alex and Jonas could save her. So, after a bitter falling out between Ren and Jonas, Alex is given the choice of who should accompany her back to the island's main town to find keys to the home of one Margaret Adler, the oldest and only permanent resident of the island prior to her death a few days before the game's story starts, with the reasoning that she must have had a boat that they can borrow in order to escape the island. Incidentally, this juncture is the only opportunity you get to spend actual proper one-on-one time with Nona, and because I like her character so much, that's usually the way I choose to go personally. No matter who you choose though, this sequence is pretty important as far as character development goes, since it's an opportunity to get to know Alex's friends a bit more closely, even Jonas, despite the fact that he's been accompanying Alex throughout the game entirely thus far. I won't spoil the back half of the game in this review, but that should give you a good idea of the pacing, flow, and structure of the game's story, and the intimate level of emphasis it places on character depth and relationships as a means of giving Alex, and vicariously the player, something to hold on to while the world around them goes to hell, and almost literally at that. Throughout all of this, whichever character you're partnered with will keep conversation flowing, and you're given up to 3 options of how to respond for any given prompt. There's also an achievement for playing the entire story without ever picking any dialogue options, because these options do expire after just a handful of seconds. It's not possible to get through the game without Alex ever talking, mind, but avoiding dialogue options as a whole is an option unto itself, and that's yet another thing that I applaud. Now, in a game where this much emphasis is placed on choice to such an extent that not choosing, that's not-choosing, is considered a choice unto itself, you might expect that the game has a variety of different endings based on whether or not you made the right choices during your time on Edwards Island. In reality, yes and no. Major spoilers incoming, like more so than anything I've said so far. Technically speaking, there are only two endings in the strictest sense of the term. There's the main one, where by some sleight of time and space the whole story loops and the epilogue narration slips back around into the opening narration, and then it's a New Game Plus variant with a bonus scene at the end of the credits, where if you make the right choices in that, which somehow takes place before the beginning as well, you can break the time loop, or so it seems. But that's just talking about the end of the gameplay, as opposed to the end of the narrative. As far as the story is concerned, there isn't a concrete good ending, bad ending, middling ending, dog ending, mushroom ending, or whatever, but rather a series of variables that leads to a whole host of different permutations of the one ending, such as whether or not Alex and Jonas remain friends, whether or not Ren and Nona become a couple, and whether or not Clarissa finally moves on from Alex's brother's death. It's all those little conversation choices Alex makes throughout the story that determines each one of those outcomes, which all adds up into the ending that you do get to experience. And I admire stories that can do that, stories that can tie up all the loose ends that you care about, and then if there's anything left unresolved after that, it's stuff that you don't mind being unresolved. Not out of a lack of caring, but through satisfaction that it's not worth worrying about. Incidentally, another story that does that really well is Summerhill by Kevin Frayne. I'm not being paid to say that, I just think it's a really good book that deserves a shout out. What was I talking about again? Right. So, how you conduct yourself around the other characters, and that includes when interacting with the ghosts and the things that Alex says during flashbacks of every kind, determines her relationships with her friends and how the story ends. So in a way, it creates some kind of symbiotic feedback loop where you're inclined to care about the characters and how they develop, so you care about how the story ends for them, and by playing a visual novel of sorts, you have a vested interest in getting the best, or your most preferred, ending. And so to achieve that, you care about the characters. And that's quite clever, really. It does help, in all of that the characters are legitimately well written, and that they're accurate representations of teenagers their age in that situation. At no point is your immersion shattered by a supposedly teenage character talking the way a middle-aged executive office cubicle shut-in thinks that kids these days talk, with their lols and their viral videos and their can-has cheeseburgers. And that deserves a special credit, because not only do they absolutely nail the writing under ordinary circumstances, they nail it when the characters are under duress as well, which is even harder to write. No one breaks character, no one has shoddy voice acting in any way, no one breaks immersion, no one entity in the game is poorly written, and no one entity is poorly performed. Not even in a cheesy, campy, over-the-top, haha lol, it's a ghost story kind of. It's very sincerely delivered, and again, I admire that. In fact, the only one criticism that I do have as far as any of that goes is one tiny thing that bothers me a little bit more than it should. At the halfway point that I stopped describing the story at earlier, Alex obtains an upgraded radio that allows her to undertake an optional side quest in the form of a scavenger hunt, where tuning the radio to a certain frequency will relay a message in NATO alphabet code. I refuse to call that the phonetic alphabet, because it is in no way phonetic, and the phonetic alphabet is already a thing. It's that, look at it. It's not the same thing, damn it! My one and only complaint with that side quest is that the actor reading out the clues makes 2 layers of mistake with the letter S. Somehow, first of all, they misread Sierra as Sienna, as in, you know, the Crayola pencil pigment burnt sienna. But then, in misreading it as Sienna, they then go on to mispronounce it as SIENNA. You know, as in... I apologise so much for that joke. And the semi-recent update to the game, which added subtitles to things that didn't have them before, which includes those clues, confirms this little theory of mine, but that's just something that only I would take issue with, so it's not really worth getting angry about in the grand scheme of things, I suppose. Now, there is one thing that I mentioned before that I really ought to put more emphasis on than I did. I alluded to the existence of this game featuring a New Game Plus option, and if it interests you at all, that's the version that I Let's Played. To summarise, it's the same story again, but with a few minor changes compared to the vanilla first-time run-through of the story. Firstly, some of the dialogue is a bit different. Some scenes are shorter or longer, with the occasional reference to something like, "Oh, this seems familiar," or "I know you've experienced this before, Alexandra," etc. And secondly, in the vanilla version of events, there are points in the game where Alex gets caught in a really small, really local time loop, which she escapes by adjusting these old-fashioned reel-to-reel machines. In the New Game Plus, these sequences are extended, giving her the opportunity to try and send messages to her past self to stop her from ever coming to the island in the first place and thus breaking the loop. These messages then recur in the bonus ending scene I mentioned before, and obviously that isn't present in the first time playthrough of the game, so. Overall, the New Game Plus is a really cleverly implemented thing, just for how much more story and character it's able to inject into the base game. The way I've described it to my friends when trying to sell them on the game is that the first time playthrough is the game presenting the story with a completely straight face, while the New Game Plus is the game telling its story whilst being aware that it's a game telling a story, and at that, a story you've been told before. So you already know what's going to happen, you already know the story, the game knows it's already told it to you. What can it do with that idea? Really, it's not something that I can do much justice to in a raw description. It's something that has to be experienced, and experienced with the initial playthrough as a foundation at that. I think the best aspect of it, though, is that while it adds so much to the whole sensation of living through the story, it's by no means required, so you don't lose anything over your decision of whether or not to play it, but at the same time, you gain so much by playing through it. I'd imagine, though, that the best way of doing it is to play through the game fully once, then leave it for a fair while, and then come back, quite forgetting that the New Game Plus is a thing, and yeah, after all, that's basically the mentality that Alex finds herself with the second time around. So anyway, that's how Oxenfree leaves me feeling, so it now falls to me to distill all of that into a single letter on an arbitrary scale of pronounceable symbols. This might contradict something that I said in a previous review, hell it will contradict something I said in a previous review, namely that I felt that Even the Ocean was the best game of 2016, but while I do stand by that, and I stand by the rating I gave it, in spite of that, I'm going to give Oxenfree a perfect A rank. Truth be told, there isn't much of anything that I can honestly criticise about the game. It has the optimal running time for the story it's trying to tell, it's well written, it's well delivered, it delivers its story in just the right way, by the way, with an immersive world and plausible characters. In short, it's more or less the perfect modern-day equivalent of the campfire ghost stories of old. And the best part is that you get to decide how it develops as you play. You get to decide whether or not Clarissa gets what's coming to her. You get to decide whether or not Ren gets karma for his behaviour. You know, you get to decide whether or not Jonas fits in. The only things I can think to pull it up on are, maybe if you're not fully invested you might not completely understand the story the first time around, or you might think that aspects of it are trite and cliche, but that's all subjective stuff, and this review totally isn't subjective unto itself. Point is, I really cannot think of any area in which the game missteps or underperforms at all. It's just really good. The closest thing to an issue that it has, maybe, is that on some less powerful computers, the game can run very slowly, particularly in the rather large bridge ferry area, and when the game slows down, which I must reiterate only happens on less able computers, the dialogue and dialogue options still run at normal speed, but the speed of the subtitles is slowed down proportionally to how long they would be on screen, multiplied by how slowly the game is actually running, and the next voice clip doesn't play until its associated subtitle appears on screen, so that does mean that conversations take a lot longer to get through, but once again, that's only if you're on a computer that can't handle the game, and hey, that's a good way of programming the voice lines so they don't run away with you anyway. So, good job there. Truthfully, it's a gripping story with a beautiful, painterly art style and an amazing soundtrack, which is available for purchase separately from the game itself, if that interests you at all, and it should. Very good soundtrack, you've been listening to it this entire time. It's an absolute must-play for anyone into this kind of story. Sure, the game takes place in the summer, but it fits quite nicely into the autumnal ghost story aesthetic, I find. So, give it a go, it's worth it, I promise. So, to give you the opportunity to go and do that, I shall be signing off. But before I do, as ever, it's that time in the video again where I shout out my supporters over on patreon.com/TessHex, the people without whom these videos wouldn't be happening in the first place. For as little as $1 a month, you can join them in supporting me, and in exchange, you get a whole load of perks, including the main one, the ability to watch these videos a month before they're released to the public on YouTube, which means, amongst other things, that they're more seasonally appropriate when they're released. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. There. Also, if you do the maths, you should realise that if you're watching this on YouTube right now, there are 2 more Patreon-exclusive videos that you could go and watch right this second just by becoming a patron. But I've rambled for quite enough about that, so I shall now, as promised, remind you that I have been, and will continue to be, Tessellating Hexagons, and I bid you all a fond farewell. Until next time.